Welcome to this UCL lunch hour lecture on Can Good Sleep Help Our Brain as We Age? My name is Josh King-Robson and I'm a clinical research fellow at the UCL Dementia Research Centre, and I'll be chairing today's lecture. It is my honour and pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr Victoria Garfield. Dr Garfield is a senior research fellow in genetic epidemiology at the MRC Unit for Lifelong Health and Ageing, based at the Institute of Cardiovascular Science. She has a background in psychology, statistics, and a PhD in genetic epidemiology. Victoria's research has focused on sleep epidemiology for the last 10 years, which includes an understanding of whether poor sleep might cause health problems as we get older. A particular interest in this area is dementia, and whether changing our sleep habits could help prevent neurodegenerative disease. Victoria also has another stream of research which focuses on understanding why people with diabetes or high blood pressure are more likely to be diagnosed with dementia. Before we begin, I'd like to let you know that we will have some time at the end of the lecture for questions, and these could be submitted at any time during Victoria's talk by going to sly.do, which can be entered into your internet browser by entering the code and entering the event code #brain. I'll now hand over to Victoria for their talk.
Thank you very much, Josh, for that lovely introduction. Good afternoon, everybody. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. And today I'm going to speak to you a little bit about sleep and whether sleep can help our brains as we get older. So the aim of today's lecture is to try to persuade you all that good sleep is essential for our brains as we age. Firstly, I'd like to talk a little bit about some other important facts about poor sleep. So poor sleep has some important risk factors, which you may or may not know about. These come in the form of smoking. So smoking is a risk factor for poor quality sleep, or having insufficient sleep, or too much sleep. Alcohol consumption affects our brains, as we know, and this does affect our sleep quite drastically. And being sedentary or being physically inactive is also a very strong risk factor for poor sleep. Now we're going to look at the other direction and what might happen in terms of our health and negative health consequences when we have poor sleep. So one thing is we have a higher risk of heart disease. We have an increased risk of type 2 diabetes, in particular in middle age, a higher risk of high blood pressure, and an increased risk of becoming overweight or obese. So these negative health consequences, we know they're quite well established from decades, 2 to 3 decades of epidemiological or health research in very, very large samples in the population, both from the UK, Europe, the States, and all over the world. So these are quite well established things. So despite all of this, sleep has been largely ignored. But there is hope. So in 2020, the Lancet Commission on Dementia added sleep to its important risk factors for dementia, particularly Alzheimer's disease, which, as you might know, is the most common form of dementia in the population. If you're interested in understanding a bit more about the Lancet Commission, there is a lay summary provided by the Alzheimer's Society charity website. Another thing that gives us a bit of hope is that there's been more stuff and more interest on sleep in the media in recent years, and this includes our own research. We've had about 3 to 4 studies in the media in the last few years that have gained a lot of attention, and there are also a couple of really nice sleep podcasts out there, which are really nice because they do explain why sleep is so important in terms that are sort of more easy to understand. So they dissect the research in some more simple terms. Another thing which has happened in the last sort of 5 to 10 years more so is an increase into genetic research of sleep. So we're beginning to understand a lot more about the genetic basis of sleep and why it might be important. So just to talk briefly about some basic sleep terms and concepts. One thing that I'll be focusing on quite a lot in this lecture is sleep duration. And the reason for that is that sleep duration is very, very easy to measure. So as you might imagine, measuring sleep is quite difficult. So we largely ask people to self-report their sleep because that's a cheap and easy option. There are other ways, as you might know, of measuring sleep. So bringing people into a sleep lab and hooking them up. and monitoring them overnight. And there are also things like some of you might have a watch that measures your sleep, and there are waist-worn accelerometers that also measure sleep. But sleep duration is one of the most popular things that we look at. And this simply refers to the number of hours slept per night. It's also known as total sleep time, or TST. Another important concept is sleep timing, or chronotype, and this refers to somebody's sleep schedule. You might have heard of the morning lark versus evening owl distinction. And this, you might know people who will say to you, I'm more of a morning person. I like to get up early, spring into action at 6, 7 a.m. I have friends who, they're up walking the dog by 4, 5 a.m. Or some people who might say to you, actually, I'm more productive at night and I like to stay up late and work in the evening. Sleep quality is really, really important. And it usually refers to when people self-report how satisfied they are with their sleep. And to measure this in research, we use validated, standardized questionnaires where we ask people lots of different things to build a picture of how well they sleep. And then we would have a sort of rating, a sort of score of whether they sleep, they have from poor sleep to very good sleep. Another important thing is sleep stages, just to be aware of. There are 4 stages of sleep, and we pass through these sequentially throughout the night. So why is sleep so important? So sleep is absolutely crucial for our physical and mental health, our cognitive function, which I'll talk about quite a lot here because I'm talking about the brain, and that refers to our thinking skills, and I'll elaborate a little bit more on that further. Quality of life, and also just general well-being. So sleep, like eating and breathing, is a necessity for human beings, and it's not an option. So we know that when we don't sleep, we don't function. The average human being doesn't function as well on little or no sleep. And if any of you are shift workers, or you are parents, you probably have experienced this. Or, for example, when we have jet lag and we haven't slept on a plane, or we haven't slept well. So it really is a necessity. And it's required usually on a daily basis to ensure that one occurs. So to ensure that we maintain our physical and mental health and cognition as much as possible. So just some interesting, important facts about sleep that you may or may not know. So human beings spend an average of about 30% of their lives asleep. Sleep decreases as a function of age. Lots of us will know an older adult who sleeps between 5 to 6 hours, and this can be due to daytime naps, which, my granddad, he would always fall asleep in his chair after having his lunch. So this is a really common thing, and that changes as we get older. And sleep deprivation, which is obviously not good for us at all, and a flawed reactor design played a really important role in the human error that led to the Chernobyl disaster. So you may or may not have known that already. So just thinking a little bit about how long the average adult sleeps for. So over here on the left, we have a normal distribution curve, a bell-shaped curve, and this shows roughly that adults in the population sleep for about 7.5 hours on average. We'll all have slightly different sleep times, and that's why there's a standard deviation. So either side of this curve of about 1.25 hours, so 1.25 hours. So you might be thinking, oh, why only sleep for 6 hours? Or someone else might be thinking, oh, I sleep for 10 or 11 hours sometimes. And that is just sometimes part of life, and part of just needing to sleep longer sometimes, or needing to wake up early sometimes and sleep for less. This graph on the left shows what I talked about in the slide before, which indicates that as we get older, we sleep for fewer hours up until death. So we spend more time awake. This represents babies who spend more time asleep, and this represents that we spend more time awake as we get older. As per the American Academy of Sleep Medicine, we should be aiming, so adults should be aiming to sleep for between 7 to 9 hours a night, roughly. And it is important to try to sleep for that amount of time every night of the week. I know that obviously life sometimes prevents us from doing that, and it's very, very common. We all talk about, you know, having a lie-in at the weekend, perhaps, or when we're off work, to compensate and make up for that. And that's not necessarily a good thing to do, but it's also a cultural and societal thing that is sometimes unavoidable. So I'm now going to talk about sleep and cognitive function and brain health. So cognitive function refers to our thinking skills. And in that sense, it refers to things like memory. So it could be, you know, your short-term, long-term memory, thinking a little bit about the different types of memory, for example, visual memory. So, for example, if you're shown something on a screen and then it disappears, how well you can remember that. You know, how correctly you can remember that, and things like processing speed or reaction time as well. And we need reaction times, for example, when we're driving. And these are all things that naturally decline as we get older, and we refer to this as cognitive decline. But there are things we can do to slow down the decline. And here, brain health specifically refers to our physical brain and its structure and function as we get older. This is typically measured using magnetic resonance imaging or MRI scans. So, you know, it's quite common to have an MRI scan of different parts of the body. And it's a way to understand what's actually happening to the brain physically as we get older. And there are certain parts of the brain that shrink more rapidly in individuals who are more likely to have a diagnosis of dementia or have a diagnosis of dementia, for example. So it's a really objective, important way to understand what's happening to our brain as we get older. So overall, what does the evidence tell us? As that's what we care about here. We care about talking about research and what the evidence says. So we know from a few decades of research that poor sleep quality is linked to impaired cognitive function. So it's linked to worse thinking skills. And that can be in the form of processing speed, memory, spatial awareness, lots of different aspects that make up our cognitive function and thinking skills. So this would have been measured through one of those scales that I talked about earlier, where people self-report how good their sleep is. And the types of questions that people are asked in those questionnaires are things like whether you have a partner that you share the bed with, so a bed partner, because that can obviously disrupt our sleep, whether you snore, whether you sleep with somebody who snores, what it's like in the environment that you sleep in, whether it's loud outside, whether you wake up feeling tired, whether you wake up and you don't feel well rested, you wake up too early. So all these sorts of questions are asked to build a picture of people's sleep quality. So thinking a little bit about the extremes of sleep duration, of that total nighttime sleep that I talked about. Here we talk about the extremes as being too short or too long. And generally that's referred to individuals who sleep for less than 6 to 7 hours for the short extreme, and people who sleep for more than 9 hours, that would be classed as quite long sleep. And this is something that it's important to remember, that we're not here to scare anybody. So, you know, a lot of people could be thinking, well, you know, last week I slept for 10 hours, you know, 2 days in a row, but I was really tired and I had X, Y, and Z going on in my life. And all these things are cumulative over many, many, many years. So it's not to say that if you do these things occasionally that your brain will be very, very badly affected. It's to say that if you do them very, very often, you could be increasing risk of worse thinking skills or risk of Alzheimer's disease. But I'll talk a bit more about in a bid to like I say, to not scare people. I'll talk a bit more about other things that are also important to keep our brains healthy. So this is all well and good, but how can we be sure that poor sleep actually causes worse thinking skills or cognitive function or increased risk of Alzheimer's disease? Could it also be in the opposite direction, that having Alzheimer's disease might cause poor sleep? or it could be both. And that's what we refer to as a bidirectional relationship. So an important thing to think about, which I also always like to mention, is that you may have heard this when you've read about research in the media, that correlation or association does not mean causation. So what does this mean? So finding a correlation or an association, it's the same thing, between sleep duration and cognitive function does not automatically mean that poor sleep duration itself causes the worst cognitive function or vice versa. So I'll explain this with an example. So this is a classic sort of graphic that we would use in health research or epidemiology research to try to figure out what might be going on and what pathways are affected and what might cause something else. So it's a really complex sort of picture and thing to figure out. And we're not the only people in sleep epidemiology who deal with this. So what you can see here on the left is sleep duration. And then I've put 2 arrows in either direction for cognitive function or thinking skills, because like I said, it could be that it works in both directions. Now, if we ignore this box up here for a second and you conduct a study and you say, and you measure sleep duration, perhaps by asking people how many hours they sleep per night on average, and then you do a standardized cognitive battery, cognitive test to understand how good people's cognitive function is, and you find a correlation between the two in that direction, you will potentially conclude that sleep duration is the culprit here. So sleep duration is the underlying causal culprit for worse cognitive function. If you do the test in the opposite direction, you might conclude the same thing, that worse cognitive function could lead to worse sleep duration. However, that could be a mistake. And when we do health research, we need to consider that there could be a third factor, and often a long list of third factors that could be involved in this relationship. So smoking, as I mentioned at the beginning, smoking is something that affects pretty much all of our organs. As we all know, it's not good for you. And in this case, sleep duration and cognitive function are no exception. So smoking affects your sleep and smoking affects your cognitive function. So it could be that you find a relationship or a correlation between sleep duration and cognitive function due to an underlying common cause, so that the underlying causal culprit is actually smoking, which is causing both of these problems. Now, you might be thinking, okay, but it could be something else. Absolutely. It could be alcohol consumption. It could be being physically inactive. It could be if you have comorbidities like diabetes, high blood pressure, all those things which are really common, high cholesterol, really common in middle age. So this is really important to think about. And we spend a huge amount of time trying to figure out what might cause what and how we might begin to understand that. Because as you can imagine, if we're going to recommend things for clinical practice, for or policy changes for the NHS, then we need to be sure of what we're recommending. So in the last decade, advances have allowed us to understand whether poor sleep in fact causes worse cognitive function or dementia, or vice versa. I'm going to focus on this direction of poor sleep causing worse cognitive function and not the other direction at the moment. So this is all well and good, but what have we contributed to the field? So we've published 3 studies, 2 of which are fully published, and one which has both of which have received substantial media coverage. One which came out this year, which I'll talk about as well. The other study is in a form which we call preprint, which means it has not been fully peer reviewed yet, but we are hoping to publish that very soon. So I'll talk a little bit about the first study. So back in 2019, we had a brilliant master's student, Dr. Albert Henry, who has now just finished his PhD actually at UCL. And we decided that we wanted to try to understand whether extreme sleep duration, so at the short and long ends of the spectrum, might cause worse cognitive function, so worse thinking skills. And to do that, Albert carried out this brilliant study for his master's project, for his dissertation, and we published it in one of these in one of the best journals for epidemiology. So what we did here, so what we wanted to understand is whether short sleep might cause poorer thinking skills, and whether long sleep also might cause poorer thinking skills. And one of the reasons to focus, you might be thinking, well, we've heard a lot, for many years about sleep deprivation. Sleep deprivation, as we know, is not good for us. But we now know that there is a relationship that we refer to in statistics as a U-shaped relationship, which means that either ends, either extreme, are not good for us. So why we were able to look at long sleep in this context is because we used a very large sample. You may have heard of it. It's called the UK Biobank study. And the UK Biobank study has 500,000 people from the UK who have volunteered to take part. And it started between 2006 and 2010. And we're following them up to try to understand the aging process with a lot of detail. So these individuals were aged 40 to 69 at the recruitment phase. And obviously now they are older. So we have a lot of information from them, including their cognition and thinking skills, and we know about their sleep. We have blood where we've taken DNA. We are able to link to their NHS records. So we really have a real breadth of data thanks to these amazing participants. And so the reason that we're able to also look at long sleep for the first time in this context is because we actually have enough people in that group who sleep for more than 9 hours. So I just want to tell you a little bit about the cognitive tasks that we looked at, in case they're of interest. You might be wondering how you measure these things in research. So one of the things we wanted to measure was visual memory, and we have this measure of visual memory in all of the 500,000 UK Biobank participants. And what they were shown was this sort of screen, and they had pairs of cards which they were shown and then disappeared, and then they had to remember where each pair of cards had appeared on the screen. So what was then measured was the number of errors that they made in matching the pairs of cards. That means that a higher value, a little bit counterintuitive, means that they have a poorer visual memory. Then we had a reaction time task, fairly self-explanatory. They just had to push the button. So it's a game of snap, and it's the time taken to press the button when the cards are the same and they want to say snap. So again, a higher value means a slower reaction time, which means a poorer reaction time. So what did we find in this study? So we found, so our mean or average sleep in this sample was about 7.2 hours, so 7-ish hours. So most people, the UK Biobank participants at this point were aged about 54 years old, and they slept for just over 7 hours. So compared to this group, compared to the reference group, as we call it, individuals who slept for less than 7 hours a day had a somewhat poorer visual memory performance. So they made more errors on matching the cards. And then individuals at the other end of the spectrum who slept for more than 9 hours a day also had a poorer visual memory as compared to this group. We also found that people in both of those extreme ends of the spectrum of sleep duration also had a somewhat slower processing speed and reaction time for the game of snap. So I always like to talk about this, and does this matter? Is this important? And we would say yes, absolutely. We as sleep researchers and epidemiologists, we want to convince people that sleep should be paid more attention to, particularly in clinical practice. We know that it's extremely difficult at the moment. with the way that, you know, things are working in the NHS. Obviously, you can't bring people in and ask everybody about their sleep, but we do really want to try to push to bring this into clinical practice, because it's not something that's paid attention to at all. And the important thing about sleep is that it's a modifiable behavior. It's also important because improving sleep habits could represent a therapeutic target for better cognitive function, better thinking skills. So this means that you know, we're using therapeutic fairly loosely here. It doesn't necessarily mean drugs or medications. It could be that you know, this is with medications we could improve cognition if we improve sleep, or it could be something a bit more natural, if people want to try that. You know, therapeutic could mean non-medical, non-pharmaceutical. We also think from our study that more attention should be paid to long sleep and not only short sleep duration, because this is something that's quite new, and we've shown that this could be a causal relationship, a causal correlation, which is quite important. So this is some of the media coverage that we had back in 2019 for this study led by Albert. So now I'm going to talk about a second study, which is a little bit different, but it also relates to sleep and the brain. So this study was on daytime napping and cognitive function, so thinking skills and brain size, and it was led by brilliant PhD student Valentina Paz, who's based in Uruguay, but works with us at UCL as well, and with our excellent collaborator, Dr. Hassan Dashti from Harvard University. And what we wanted to understand here was whether taking a daytime nap might cause better cognitive function, might cause us to have better thinking skills. And the thinking skills or cognitive function measures would be the same ones that we used in the previous study. So the matching of the card pairs to measure visual memory, and the SNAP game to measure reaction time or processing speed. So we use the same data set, roughly the same people. We used the UK Biobank study. Again, we needed a very large sample. So those two measures are the same. Additionally, what we did for the first time was to, because the UK Biobank participants have undergone whole body MRI, we have scans of their brain that have been segmented and processed by some very clever colleagues, and we are able to understand the size of the whole brain and the size of each brain structure, which is really important. And there are certain brain structures that are that shrink more rapidly in people who are more likely to have dementia. For example, the hippocampus, which is greatly involved in learning and memory. But the measure of the whole brain, which we call total brain volume, and we measure that in cubic centimeters, that's a really important way to also determine how rapidly our brain is aging in a quite a straightforward way. So we were looking at all of this in this study. The rationale or the idea that I had for this part of the study to do with thinking skills came from some really interesting experiments done by a lab in the States, led by a professor called Sarah Mednick. And she's found, using experimental approaches, that essentially napping could be causally linked to better thinking skills. And they recommend napping for up to 1 to 2 hours a day could be helping with that. I'll talk a bit about that later though. And then we additionally have the data from 35 to 40,000 individuals who have an MRI scan. So what did we find? So we found our main finding was that taking a daytime nap regularly, and this refers to people who responded that they are frequent daytime nappers, so we refer to them as habitual nappers, it appears that it could certainly help preserve the size of our brains as we age. Now, this does not mean that having a nap can change our brain. It can't increase the size of our brain, but the individuals who have a regular daytime nap had a larger brain size. as opposed to the individuals who are less likely to nap. But we did not find an effect of daytime napping on thinking skills or cognitive function. It's possible that our study looked at slightly different aspects of cognitive function compared to the studies from the States. So that's something that we were not able to replicate, but we need to think a bit more about for future work. So does this matter? Absolutely. So reduced brain size is linked to higher stress levels as measured by cortisol, greater risk of earlier mortality, and risk of sleep apnea, which is a sleep disordered breathing, which is quite common in midlife, particularly in males who are overweight or obese, and other things as well. And reduced brain size, importantly, is linked to greater risk of dementia. So if we want to try to preserve our brain size for as long as possible, and a daytime nap is a potential way to do that, then why not give it a try? We all, at least all of those who are of working age, we could do with, taking a break in the day and doing something that might help our brain health. Also importantly, taking a nap can help compensate for short or long or poorer sleep at night, but it's not meant to replace nighttime sleep. We still need to be sleeping at night to replenish our brain cells and feel rested in the morning and tackle the next day. So that's not what we're recommending here at all. So this study essentially went viral. I think we were even on TikTok, Instagram, all sorts of places. Have I got news for you? Did a tweet about the study. We were on BBC Radio, lots of places, lots of interest in this study. And I think one of the reasons, especially when I spoke to people on the radio very early in the morning, 5 o'clock onwards, was that these people would say to me, "Oh, we nap because we get up early to work," but we didn't know that it might be a positive thing. So one thing about this study that was really nice was that we were coming to the public with a positive message rather than if you do this, then you'll get this illness, or if you don't do this, you'll get this illness, which unfortunately is often what we find when we're doing medical research. And we need to tell people, obviously, what we find, whether it's good or bad. But it was really nice to have something positive and to say, well, maybe taking a break in the day and having a nap could be a good thing for your brain as you get older. So what other research are we doing in this area of sleep and cognitive function, or sleep and thinking skills? So thanks to a grant from the UCL Global Engagement Office, I have a project with some brilliant collaborators over at the All Indian Institute Medical Sciences Institute in New Delhi, which has been going on now for a couple of years. And this project is around understanding sleep quality and cognitive function and brain health using MRI scans in Indians residing in India, specifically in New Delhi, compared with Indians residing in the UK. And we're able to do this because my absolutely brilliant collaborators over there, who I'll show you in a second, are collecting data from individuals over in New Delhi, measuring their sleep quality with a questionnaire and some other measurements as well that are a bit more objective, so using some devices. They're administering a cognitive test as well, and they're scanning their brains in the MRI scanner. And over here in the UK, my boss set up a study many years ago, which is a triethnic study, and we're able to use the Indian Asian portion of the study to compare with individuals residing over in India. So why would we want to do this? Well, it's possible that the relationship or the correlation between sleep quality and cognitive function or brain size might be different between these two groups. So we know that there are differences in effects and correlations across ethnicities sometimes. So, for example, individuals of South Asian descent are more likely to have, they're at greater risk of diabetes, for example. We don't understand all the underlying etiology of that at the moment, but we know that this is the fact. And it is possible that there's also differences between individuals who have migrated over to the UK, many years ago, and have had their children here, as compared to the sort of original population, the original host population based over in India. And this could be due to cultural adaptations, it could be due to diet, because it won't be due to genetics, because their genetics will be very, very similar. So this is something that we think is really, really important, particularly because the prevalence of dementia is increasing in India as well, quite rapidly. So it's not something that we just need to be concerned with over here in the West. And this is the team. I visited them in May this year. It was very, very hot, but it was a brilliant, fantastic experience. We spent most of the time eating amazing food, and of course we were able to process some data, and I met a lot of people from the department. So yeah, really, really amazing experience. So some really important things to think about that I'd like to mention as we come towards the end, is that all research studies have shortcomings, and these studies are no exception. So all scientific studies have limitations and issues, and no science is done perfectly. We do the best that we can with the data that we have available, or with the data that we're able to collect from people, and bearing in mind that sometimes we're bringing people into clinic and doing even quite invasive measures on them to really understand what's going on in different parts of the body, different organs, different tissues. So it's important to remember that no research is perfect. The specific method that we use, and I mentioned earlier on that has become available in the last decade or so, is thanks to the advent of genetics and genetic epidemiology. So essentially, my job that I do now was not a job 20, 30 years ago. So it's all to do with the advent of the Human Genome Project, and genetics and genetic epidemiology coming really, really far. And the method that we use is because we have access to DNA. However, it's not the only method available to understand whether one thing causes another. And lots of our brilliant colleagues use other methods, which use mathematical modeling, which are just as good, or perhaps even superior sometimes, depending on what question you're asking. Really importantly, as I've mentioned earlier, we rely on volunteers from the population, as we need very large samples to carry out these studies. And we are very grateful that people continue to volunteer for our studies. We have data from thousands, hundreds of thousands of people, and up to millions sometimes. And often we're asking for people to consent to us also being able to access their NHS records to really understand and build a picture of what's going on as people age in the population. Another important thing is that everything I've presented here today is the result of a team effort. Research is always collaborative, and we need people with different expertise. So everything that I've presented here is due to a huge team effort in the background. And we only present a snippet, but it's years of work that goes on in the background. And obviously you might see something in the media that's written up in a short article, but it is years of work and effort and coding and things going wrong and fixing them in the background. So just to summarize, or maybe what the bottom line is here, is that good quality and sufficient sleep is crucial for our brains as we get older, crucial to preserve the health of our brains, so that the physicality of our brains, but also our thinking skills as we get older. And equally, good and sufficient sleep could also help reduce the risk of multiple common diseases, such as diabetes, heart disease, high blood pressure, obesity, etc. So good sleep is very, very important. And I just wanted to end with a few tips. You may already know these, if you're struggling with your sleep. So we now know that recommending sleeping for longer isn't necessarily ideal. So you might have bad quality sleep, but you might sleep for 10 hours. So we wouldn't recommend that staying in bed and sleeping for longer is necessarily ideal in that situation. We should be aiming to sleep for between 7 to 9 hours, and try to note the time that you get into bed versus the time you actually fall asleep, because that's different. And the time that you fall asleep is what you want to sort of document. And then you could document the time that you wake up as well. If you'd like to nap, based on our new findings that we're quite confident in, keep it to a maximum of 30 minutes if you can. And the reason for that is to ensure that you don't fall into the next stage of sleep, which is known as deep sleep, because that's when people report that they wake up feeling worse, feeling groggy. So to not fall into that and then almost make your day worse, we would recommend not napping for more than about 30 minutes. Regular exercise is fantastic to help you sleep, but not too close to bedtime. So no more than about 2 hours. So leave about 2 hours between that and going to bed. We all know this, avoiding caffeine about 3 hours before bed. It does keep us awake. It is scientific. And you could keep a sleep diary for a week or two, or if you like, and you can afford it, you could get a smartwatch to track your sleep, and that could help you make some changes in your sleep schedule. Of course, if these things above don't work, speak to your GP, and you might consider other options, other interventions. But I would try some of the above first if you're able to. So this is just to highlight again, the team effort, and here you can see some universities from all over the world that I work with and I've worked with for a long time now. So all of these efforts are global and collaborative. And that's all. Thank you very much for attending, and I hope that everybody is still awake, and I think we have time to take some questions.
Thank you, Dr. Garfield, for a really excellent talk. We've got quite a few questions already appearing in the Slido, but if you do have any questions, you can submit them now with the hashtag brain. If I may open the questions, I was sort of interested in your really interesting findings on napping. And as someone who struggles to nap, am I genetically doomed to have a smaller brain? And will sleeping, forcing myself to nap, help with that? Or do you think it's more the people who are genetic nappers who will benefit?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. Thank you for that. So, we know that the genetic basis of napping is something that we're beginning to uncover. And of course, if you are one of the people who is more genetically predisposed to be a frequent napper, you might find it a little bit easier. However, I wouldn't say that necessarily forcing yourself to nap is the answer, because as discussed in the lecture, there are lots of other things to be doing to build a healthy kind of profile as we get older. So if you're not able to nap and it's something that you don't want to force yourself to do, I wouldn't necessarily do that. And perhaps take 30 minutes of your day doing something that will help you and you find easier. And that could be going for a walk, or doing a bit of gardening, or going for a run, or a swim, or just taking some time to do some housework. Anything that can help de-stress you personally, for maybe up to about 30 minutes should. You'll still be reducing your risk of all those horrible diseases that I was harping on about.
Great, thank you. There's a few other questions here. So someone's asked, how can someone such as a student who's become nocturnal best shift their sleeping times, and should they be doing that?
Very good question. So I talked a little bit about chronotype and sleep timing, and there is a somewhat genetic basis to this as well. However, that's not deterministic, and the genetic basis is quite small. So, like I also mentioned, sleep is a modifiable, it's a lifestyle behavior, and it is modifiable. So it all depends on the individual. If you are able to do more things throughout the night, and you're more of an owl, but you're able to function well in the day and be productive, then that's not necessarily an issue. I suppose it could become an issue when you shift from that student lifestyle to perhaps a full-time 9 to 5 type job. And in that case, I would maybe try some of the things that I put on the last slide. So maybe try keeping a sleep diary, maybe try looking at how long you sleep for, what are the sort of times that you're more alert. Caffeine, if you're consuming lots of caffeine throughout the night, that won't be helping. So I think it's something to consider, but more so maybe as you shift from that student lifestyle. I did that when I was a student as well, and found it quite difficult when I sort of went into employment and had to get up at 6 o'clock. But the body is very resilient and adaptable, and so is the brain. And the younger you do it, the easier, because the brain is more plastic as well.
Great, thank you. You showed, there's another question here, you showed quite a range of sleep times amongst the normal population. Why do you think some people need to sleep more than others?
It's a good question. It's likely to be very, partly genetic, very, very small. We know that sleep duration is not massively genetically determined, and sleep timing is a little bit more genetically determined, but it's very likely that depends on the individual and their lifestyle. So it could be that, if you're going through quite a stressful period, cortisol levels are raised, for example, you're not able to exercise as much or get outside as much, or do things that you enjoy as much, then maybe you're compensating with that by sleeping for longer. We go through phases in life which are more difficult and more stressful, and other things, life events have a real impact on the brain. For example, a bereavement has a very real physical impact on the brain, and that's been seen in MRI scans as well. So I think it's just the nature of human beings. And like I said, I think it's really important to remember that all these things, they're small effects over time that we've shown, they're cumulative, but I wouldn't panic if it's something that is happening for a short period of time. I think being aware of our sleep is what we're trying to get the message out. Just be aware and pay attention to it, rather than, it doesn't matter, I sleep for 3 hours.
There's a few more questions about napping here. So there's potentially people are sometimes given advice that napping in the day can reduce their chance of having a good night's sleep. Did you look at that, and was that something that you think is correct?
No, we have not looked at that. We in that particular study, we only looked at daytime napping as a potential cause for improved cognitive function or preserving brain size. So it would be a case of designing a slightly more complex study where we would look at basically individuals who nap, what their sleep duration at night looks like, and then their brains as well, so the brain size and their thinking skills. So it's not something that we know. I think it is a difficult one, and that's why we're recommending. I had a colleague in the office who used to sleep for 10 minutes, and she was bright as a button, and that worked for her. So I think if you want to nap, I don't necessarily see that as a problem, depending on the rest of your health profile and your lifestyle, etc. It's also important about the timing of day, the time of day for the nap, and this is something we've been asked a lot. So one way for it to not eat into your sleep time at night and make sure that you're still tired at night is to nap in the kind of post-lunch phase. So perhaps have something to eat, something light to eat, and then maybe have a nap for up to 30 minutes. And that shouldn't really eat into your sleep time at night, because that's not what we're looking for. And that's why we're saying don't take a very long nap of 1 to 2 hours, because it will potentially eat into that, and then it might make you more stressed anyway.
Thank you. There are some questions also about the stages of sleep, and do you think that how important is deep sleep, and is that something we can modify, the sort of stages of sleep, and is that something we should be looking at?
That's a very good question, and it's something that's quite difficult to look at, because one of the best ways to look at stages of sleep is with what we call polysomnography, where we bring people into the sleep lab, and we keep an eye on them, monitor them overnight. Now, that's very difficult because by bringing people into the lab and doing that, we're creating an artificial environment. So while that's the gold standard method for measuring sleep, there's issues around people not sleeping in the natural way they would at home because they're in a laboratory. So that's very, very difficult. It's something that we want to look at, and it's something that the colleagues in India are really interested in looking at, particularly for cardiovascular health as we get older. But I'm not sure exactly how we might be able to do that in a very systematic and kind of large sample. The answer is that we don't really know. I don't think we know whether, there's a causal relationship between getting more or less deep sleep and how your brain ages, or at least I don't think we know that yet.
Right, so it's a really interesting point about the sort of depth of phenotyping that you can do with these kind of numbers that you need for these genetic studies. And I guess one of the challenges of this field is disentangling whether sleep disturbance that precedes the development of dementia is part of the cause, or whether we're seeing the early consequence of those diseases. Do you think that these methods are a way that we can answer those questions, where are the sort of, I guess in some ways you answer some of them, but what do you think are the next steps, and how much is that question solved now?
Very well, it's a very good question and a very complicated one, Josh. I think we are able to answer some of that with these methods. One of the issues is that one of the largest samples that we have access to, is the UK Biobank, with the 500,000 individuals who've been amazing volunteers for all these years. However, the number of individuals with a dementia diagnosis is still relatively small. So that makes it a little bit difficult to apply some of these mathematical models and methods. But it is possible to look at that, and it's something that we want to look at and we want to do. I guess the issue will be, if we find that it's both a cause and a consequence, then what do we do in terms of clinical practice and therapeutics and so on? Because while sleep is a modifiable behavior, we can't modify the brains of individuals who have a diagnosis of Alzheimer's disease. So something to think about, and very, very complex, but potentially as things advance and we become a bit more savvy with these methods, we'll be able to do.
Nice answer. There's some questions about sleeping on the same schedule and waking up and going to sleep roughly the same every day. How important do you think that is amongst all of these different features we can modify?
Yes, important. Yeah, so we would talk about having good sleep hygiene, and that is a very, very big part of having good sleep hygiene. So in practice, of course, like I said, a lot of us, lie in at the weekend, make up lost sleep time in the week if we've been out or we've been away or we've got jet lag or God knows what we've got going on, or shift work, etc. But it is, if you are somebody who can go to bed, go to sleep at roughly the same time every night, wake up the same time every night, and do that 7 days a week, that is the best sleep hygiene you can have, and that is the best for the brain as we get older, and also for preventing all the other nasty things that we talked about. So absolutely, yeah, I think most of us can't, but for sure it's very important.
And do you think you can quantify the amount of impact that these changes have, either sleep hygiene or the napping? Do we have any marker of how much of a change that makes?
So from our napping study, we found that essentially the impact was equivalent to between 3 to 6 years of aging of the brain. So it was the difference in cubic centimeters for the whole size of the brain. So for people who were more likely to take that regular daytime nap, it may help preserve the size of the brain for another 3 to 6 years, roughly. But this is, like I said, very, very new. I don't know for sleep hygiene, we would need to do that study. We would need to get people who sleep really well, which is very, very difficult to find, and track them, and then do some really interesting causal modelling on that. But I don't think we know the answer right now.
And there's a question here about the shift work. Is there any evidence that this impacts your cognitive function regardless of the duration of a shift work? And what do we know? Do we know how, if that makes, if the length of shift working is a factor here?
I don't know, to be honest. Do you know?
I don't. Well, I think we have a bit. There are some studies which seem to, well, there's a number of studies which show it impacts cognition, and a few of them seem to have looked at length. But I don't think we've got great data on it at the moment. And I'm guessing with the UK Biobank, and it doesn't give the. I don't know if it gives the duration when you're looking at these things.
I don't think so. I think we've got information on whether people are shift workers, and there's been some interesting studies looking at the combination of genetics and environment and the impact, say, on risk of obesity. But I don't know what they've done for sleep, and I don't think the data is fantastic on length. It's a very, very good question. Someone who might be concerned about, whether you do a very, very long shift versus a shorter shift. It's a very, very good question, and something to think about as we maybe design the next wave of some of these studies.
I think we've probably got time for one or maybe two more questions. There's a question here about watches that record the time that you sleep, and they often show chunks where you're awake and short chunks where you're awake during periods of time where you're normally asleep, and how you interpret that, and how people should be using these digital measures to factor into their total sleep time. Do you have any thoughts on that?
That's a very good question. I've personally not analysed data. We haven't analysed data like that from the smartwatches. So I'm not really sure, and I know that mine doesn't do that. I also probably wouldn't pay much attention to it because it potentially make me a bit anxious and stressed. I know that the smartwatches are not amazing at measuring sleep accurately at the moment. They're the best we've got, and it's probably better than nothing, especially if you want to know how you're sleeping. But I don't think that the data is amazingly accurate. So I'm not really sure, to be honest. Is that something you know about?
Well, as you say, there's problems with the smartwatches. They are generally very good at working out if someone's awake, because someone moving is quite obvious to them, but someone still and asleep, still and awake can appear like a sleep person to them. So there are problems with their ability to differentiate that. They are probably, to answer the question question about periods where it looks like they're awake, they're probably relatively correct at those often. And probably the last question here. Someone's asked, is sleep deprivation the largest cause of Alzheimer's disease? No. We know that it is not likely to be the biggest cause. So it's a very good question. We know that Alzheimer's disease is caused by a whole host of things that are likely to be additive or cumulative over time. And there are other things that have a bigger impact, like cardiovascular problems, lots of other things that are not sleep. So sleep is very important, and we're here to persuade you that sleep is really important and to pay attention to it and not ignore it. But no, absolutely not. No. I think that's potentially a nice question to finish on. So thank you, Dr. Garfield, very much for your time, and thank you to the audience for joining us today for this lunch hour lecture. Just to mention, there will be another lunch hour lecture taking place in January, and more information can be found on X, formerly Twitter, or using @UCL events and the UCL lunch hour lecture website. Thank you very much.
Thank you.